Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Jacobs. I am a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, and I'm also the deputy director of WorkRise, a research to action network focused on economic mobility. I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone here today. If you're in DC, you know that it is literally quite warm out. If you're elsewhere, I hope you're enjoying a beautiful spring day. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your afternoon to join us. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping notes. First, the event today is being recorded, so you can go back and watch it over and over again. You can share it with your friends. We'll be posting it on the WorkRise website afterwards. All of you participants are muted, but we do encourage you to share questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time. Many of you, I'm sure, have been on Zooms like this before, and it's in the Q&A and not the chat box. We have closed captions turned on. If you'd like to adjust your settings, you can click the live transcription button at the bottom. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, we want to leave plenty of time for your questions, but I'm going to start us off giving a brief overview of WorkRise and share some details with you about our first request for proposals, which we fielded in 2020. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Caleb Quakenbush, who'll provide background and also a short demonstration for our application process for this year's RFP. And then we'll move to audience Q&A, and we should have plenty of time for that. Next slide. So as I mentioned during the intro, WorkRise is a research to action network on jobs, workers, and mobility hosted by the Urban Institute. Our mission is to accelerate economic mobility for low and middle wage workers. And these are workers who've seen their ability to advance in the labor market stall over the past decades. We also aim to strengthen long-term economic security and stability. Even before the COVID-19 recession, workers were struggling to make ends meet and save for the future. And COVID has exacerbated that economic security and left a great deal of uncertainty about what mobility might look like going forward. Finally, we aim to dismantle structural inequalities in the labor market and to advance racial and gender equity so all workers can reach their full potential. Next slide. So what makes us unique? Many entities are focused on some aspect of economic mobility in the labor market. And rather than being a competitor, WorkRise is built out to be a partner, a platform for accelerating, curating, and disseminating evidence and evidence-backed solutions to a broad set of key stakeholders with the ability to make real change in workers' lives. So how do we add value? Well, one of our greatest societal challenges is that low-wage workers experience neither economic security nor mobility. Wage growth has stalled, the ability to advance higher-paying jobs has stalled as well. Black and Latinx workers and families are disproportionately affected by a lack of economic opportunity and mobility. And we think that to solve the challenge of mobility going forward, each set of stakeholders, employers, workers, worker advocates, practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and the philanthropic community need to be at the table, but may differ in their assessment of the causes and solutions to the problem for low-wage workers. So our approach is to invest in research that both illuminates the challenges limiting economic mobility as well as potential solutions, practices, policies, programs that could accelerate mobility and strengthen economic security, ideally at scale. We convene often siloed stakeholders, that's employers, advocates, policymakers, practitioners, philanthropy, to help shape our research agenda and identify knowledge gaps that, if addressed, could drive policy and practice going forward. Our grant-making and programming decisions are guided by a leadership board comprised of thought leaders from a wide range of these stakeholders' perspectives. If you haven't already, I encourage you to check out our website to get to know a bit more about each of our phenomenal board members. We also actively engage our stakeholders to share new evidence and solutions generated by WorkRise and other sources on economic mobility with their peer networks. By partnering with diverse and engaged networks, WorkRise aims to build consensus on high-impact research questions, to reflect perspectives of different stakeholders in our research, and to identify potential solutions that are actionable, plus to foster dialogue that leads to the adoption of new practices and policies that advance economic security, opportunity, and mobility. Next slide, please. So I think this visual really effectively illustrates our engagement with stakeholders. We describe it as an iterative process by which we source new questions in order to develop our research agenda and key priorities, invest in research in order to produce new knowledge and evidence to drive action and change in policy and practice, and then share that evidence out with a diverse set of key stakeholder communities. And my slide is animated, so in a perfect world, you can actually see how those things all fit together, but I think you probably get the idea. So next slide. I've mentioned stakeholder networks a number of times, and I want to clarify who we mean when we talk about stakeholder communities. We've identified our stakeholders as the broad range of actors who have the potential to directly shape opportunities, and I would note also the potential to create barriers in the labor market. And those are employers and their networks. So that includes both major Fortune 500 firms, global conglomerates, but also small business and entrepreneurs. Workers and their advocates, including labor unions and others organizing collectively to strengthen worker voice. Practitioners who serve workers in a variety of roles and fields, including workforce development, human resources, post-secondary education, community and economic development, and human services. Policymakers at every level, so local, state, and federal, researchers and their networks, including universities and think tanks, and the philanthropic community as well. Next slide. So WorkRise aims to fund research across 4 main pillars or channels that we consider as key to shaping mobility outcomes for workers in the labor market. Broadly speaking, the 4 pillars are macroeconomic and labor market context and policies. And this bucket includes monetary policy, fiscal policy, labor market trends, automation, trade, immigration, and labor supply and demand. It's really taking seriously the fact that context matters a lot for what happens in workers' lives. And we want to make sure that we're driving research forward and understanding those relationships. Employer practices and worker power and voice. This bucket encompasses job quality, wage setting, hiring and promotion, benefit policies, working conditions, collective bargaining, and other forms of worker power. And we've bundled employer practices and worker voice because we see them in some ways as 2 sides of the same coin. Employer practice shapes the amount of work, the amount of voice that workers have, and vice versa. Skills search and matching. This includes education and training, credentialing, and also search frictions between job seekers and employers. So not only what kind of skills do workers have, but how do they actually match those skills to what's happening in the labor market? And likewise, how do employers actually go out and find the right people for their jobs? Finally, we have what we call a 360-degree perspective that places workers in the context of families and communities, relating to factors outside of work, such as family care responsibilities, housing, transportation, health, all of which we know affect labor market outcomes in really profound ways, but they're often left off the table in conversations about work. Next slide, please. So I'd like to give you a brief recap of the results of our first grant-making cycle from last year, just to give you a sense of how we've worked so far. We launched our first RFP almost exactly a year ago, right after the COVID-19 pandemic started. And it's worth noting that we originally aimed to release an RFP in the fall of 2020, in no small part because WorkRise was founded, and really we didn't actually formally launch until October 2020, but we wanted to be responsive to COVID and to what was happening in the labor market. And so we launched our RFP 6 months ahead of schedule in order to respond to the economic crisis that was unraveling around us. We received 340 submissions from a very diverse set of applicants. I'll note that more than 60% of the teams included women and more than half included people of color. We invited 25 of those LOIs to submit full proposals. And of those 9 projects, were funded based on input from our leadership board. Next slide, please. So in 2020, our 9 projects received a total of $2.1 million in funding from WorkRise. And as you can see from the slide, we're supporting a diverse range of high impact research questions and projects, including 2 pilot studies that will generate evidence on real world interventions aimed at promoting economic security and mobility. One is a study of what happens when IKEA gives employees greater scheduling control. And the other is a randomized controlled trial evaluating the Pursuit Fellowship, which is an intensive training program for IT careers that has a unique pay-for structure for participants. So next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Caleb Quakenbush, who will share information about our 2021 RFP and provide a short demo on how to apply. So Caleb, I'll let you take it from here.
All right, and I believe we have one more slide to share. But good afternoon, everyone. I'm Caleb Quakenbush. I'm a policy program manager at the Urban Institute, and I help manage WorkRise's grant-making programs. So I believe it's already mentioned, but our total grant-making pot this year is $2.5 million. And as Elizabeth did mention, our goal for the grant-making program is to support and accelerate high-quality evidence that illuminates and provides new data about the challenges to mobility faced by workers who have low wages or who are economically vulnerable, in particular workers of color. And then we want to learn about and surface solutions across all levers. So that's policies, programs, and practices that can create mobility pathways for workers. And then we also want to support pilots that test real-world interventions by employers, advocacy organizations, and service providers. So this RFP is open to researchers from universities and from other research organizations, as well as to practitioners who have or who can establish a partnership with a research team. We want to pursue a diverse grant portfolio that reflects a range of perspectives, methods, approaches. And so we're strongly encouraging submissions from researchers with underrepresented backgrounds and researchers based at historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, tribal institutions, and other minority serving institutions. Our vision of diversity also encompasses dimensions such as geography, where your organization is located, as well as gender identity and career stage. And then, so I mentioned that our total budget is $2.5 million, but we anticipate that awards will range from between about $25,000 to up to about $500,000 for a 12 to 18 month period of work. So now with that, I will share my screen and give a quick demonstration about where to find more information and how to apply. So our RFP is live on the WorkRise website. That's workrisenetwork.org. I believe we'll be dropping some of these links in the chat and be available by email and other follow-up as well. So it's right here, just in the top navigation. You can find here the full RFP is posted. We have information just generally about the RFP and what we're looking for, submission process and deadlines, an FAQ section that will be updating later next month, and then a little bit more information about that pilot components of the grant-making program that we're supporting. So if you just scroll down a bit, you can see we have a PDF download if you need to print a copy or keep a copy for your records. And then we have a link to submit your letter of inquiry. So in order to submit a letter of inquiry this year, you'll need to create an account through the Urban Institute's grants portal. That's new this year. So once you just click on that link, it'll take you to this landing page. You can see in the top right navigation, if you don't have an account already, which, if you're applying this year, you probably don't, click the account. And then once you've created an account, you can log in. And then from there, you can go to our grants programs page and find the only RFP live on the grants program at this moment. Find that RFP. You can see there's some basic information there. You can click down here at the bottom, and I realize I'm going through this fast, so if you have questions, we'll get to those. And that will give you a copy of the letter of inquiry form that we are using this year so that you can kind of prepare your responses in advance and have them ready to go once you go back and see if I can move my window here. Once you go back and hit apply, it will take you through some information again about eligibility criteria, selection criteria. Looks like we need to fix a typo. And then finally, it will walk you through the application process. And so you can fill out all of the information here. And then just to give you kind of a preview of what you'll be submitting, So we have, again, general eligibility, some basic project information about, who you are, how much you're requesting, how much funding you already have for your project. We'll ask you to kind of slot your proposal into a particular thematic track just to help us make sure that we're getting sort of the broad spectrum of different elements of worker mobility. There'll be a little bit more subtopics asking for details, and then digging into the meat of your proposal. What's the primary research question? What are some related items? What data sources are you using? How will they be able to be disaggregated? And because our intent is to accelerate impact on worker mobility, we really do strongly encourage that you have a vision and be able to articulate who the end users of your research will be. Is it an advocacy organization that can then lift that evidence up to policymakers and advocate for change? Is it employers who can then change their practices for their workforce to better support workers, et cetera? There'll be a little section about just deliverables. So again, we want to lift up evidence, so we want public-facing products. So we'll just ask, as you apply, will you be able to commit to creating some form of, public deliverables, such as, a blog, a research report, or brief, participating in events, and then we'll ask you a little bit more information about those. And then the last section just asks if you have a partner, tell us a little bit more about them, and then tell us about the research team. So not to overwhelm you with information, but that's how the letter of inquiry will look this year. And then I think we have one more slide up. If we can share that, there we go. Next slide, yep. So just the key deadlines. The first one is the public webinar. So congratulations, you're already on schedule. The next deadline to be aware of is June 13th is the deadline to submit questions about sort of the RFP process and substance. If you have questions about the grants portal, we'll be taking those up through a couple of days before the LOI submission deadline, because we understand it's new this year and there might be some additional support needed. On June 18th, we'll be answering questions as we can. But then on June 18th, we will update the FAQ section of the request for proposal webpage with some questions that we received that we think will be, good for sort of public benefit and for everyone's knowledge. And then last and crucially, June 27th is the deadline for LOI submissions. So I will kick it now back to Elizabeth to go through some remaining events and other information.
Great, thank you. So we have a few upcoming events that I want to be sure for those of you who hop off before the Q&A know about. On June 16th, Urban is co-hosting an event along with WorkRise on job quality. We have a team of researchers who've been working on this for quite some time, and we're excited to bring it to the public. It will be exploring wages and different dimensions of job quality and their links with mobility. We're also going to explore how to advance research and policy around job quality. We have some really terrific speakers lined up for this event, including Alex Hertel-Fernandez, who is the current Chief Evaluation Officer at the Department of Labor, and a worker panel featuring Lakeithia Furby, who's the Executive Director of Strive New York City, which is a workforce training provider that supports student workers, excuse me. And then on July 22nd, we'll be hosting an event on tools, research, and resources to support worker transitions across occupations, looking at occupational mobility and skills-based inclusive hiring practices. We are excited and very grateful to be including several key partners to host this event, including the Philadelphia Fed, Brookings Workforce of the Future Initiative, the Rework America Alliance, and Opportunity at Work. Many of these initiatives have their own really exciting data-driven tools, and we're very, very excited to lift those up to the public and put them in conversation with practitioners who are in the process of trying to figure out how to do this work and do it well on behalf of low-wage workers looking for mobility opportunities. So we encourage you to go to our website, subscribe to our newsletter in order to receive invitations and links to join these events, and surely many more to follow. And lastly, I just want to remind you to visit our website to subscribe to our newsletter. We'll put that sign up in the chat. You can find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can always drop us a note at workrise@urban.org. And if there are questions, we're going to get to questions, but if there are questions that you'd like to follow up on or don't feel like we've answered or that you come up with after the event wraps, that's the right email address to find us, and we will be sure to get back to you. So now I want to move it to the next slide and offer you a heartfelt thank you for taking the time this afternoon to be with us and open it up to your questions. I'm going to get us started because I actually have a number of them in the chat already. And the first one is, there's a question about whether WorkRise's mission is focused on low and mid-wage workers who are citizens of the US. And the answer is that we're focused on all workers in the United States, regardless of citizenship status. That said, I will also add that while we aren't focused on international markets, we are interested in comparative work. So if you are a researcher who wants to illuminate something about the United States case by using a comparative approach, we are certainly open to that. But the answer to the specific question is that we don't care about citizenship status. We are deeply interested in all workers. So please don't let that be a limiting factor as you're designing the work. We had a second question about pilot eligibility that I'm also going to take before I knock a question over to Caleb. On pilot eligibility, one of you has asked whether we can define our definition of service provider. And I want to say that's a great question. We have no formal definition, but I, for the purposes of giving you an answer, will say that anyone providing services designed to foster mobility or stability for low-wage workers, in our view, kind of quote unquote counts as a service provider. A few examples include a workforce training program, a childcare provider, a fintech firm that's offering, say, income smoothing or benefits access, a state workforce development agency or a UI office, for example. So we have a very expansive idea, and we could bucket those out across our 4 channels, but we're not particularly limited in terms of how we think about service provision. I'm going to let Caleb answer a question about how many LOIs you all can submit.
Yeah, so there was a question, can you submit more than one LOI for different research proposals? And the answer is yes. So, organizations can submit multiple proposals, but they do need to be for sort of distinct research projects. It probably shouldn't be, just variant A, variant B, but if they are indeed sort of separate, categorically different proposals, then by all means.
Someone has asked whether we'll be awarding equally across all 4 areas of focus. The question was actually, will you strive to award equally across all 4 areas of focus? I appreciate the phrasing of the question because the answer is yes, we will strive to award equally for a variety of reasons. But yes, our goal is to have the funding and the number of projects distributed evenly, but there is likely to be some wiggle room on that. One of you also asked, an astute pair of eyes noticed that last year there was an option to submit a letter of inquiry for organizations that were interested in being paired with researchers for their project. And so it was a request for information in addition to a request for proposals. That is not an option for this year. We're only running the request for proposals, but we are very interested if any of you on the call are practitioners or otherwise who have research questions or have something that you would love to have evaluated or answered and are interested in working with a research team, we encourage you to reach out to us through the email address that we provided earlier, workrise@urban.org, because we are working to build out the capacity to do that kind of matchmaking. So we haven't dropped that entirely, but we're not running the RFI this year, largely because we got so many amazing actual proposals last year that we wanted to be able to focus our efforts on that as we scale up and grow. Caleb, do you want to take the question on partners? How many partners? Do we have space for lots and lots of partners?
Right, yeah, so our LOI form is limited. I believe we have space for up to 2 partners. So as you are filling out the LOI, I encourage you to kind of take, maybe the biggest partners, the ones that will receive sort of the largest fraction of your grant budget, or who will be the most active in supporting the work. So that will be sort of in terms of the formal space for that. But if you can find a way in your project proposal description to mention those other three or however many partners you have and what their roles are. We encourage you to just at least mention it so that we are aware of other partners that you're working with.
There are a couple other questions that relate to the relationships that we're looking for between researchers and practitioners. So I'm going to try and bundle those and hopefully offer some clarity on that front. So first, the question is, do applicants have to have a confirmed research partner? And I think I answered that in the last answer to the RFP versus the RFI. The answer to that is this year, if you are applying, you need to have a research partner and a research question. That is for sure. If you have an idea, again, we encourage you to reach out to us. We're definitely interested in incubating and cultivating those, but we would very much, the applications are designed for research projects that have a researcher attached to them already. And hopefully that clarifies this request for a clarifying question around whether the RFP is open to researchers and practitioners who have an established partnership or seek a partnership with a research evaluation team. To clarify, we're looking for folks who actually have researcher attached if you're planning on submitting an actual LOI through the portal. Otherwise, you should reach out to us separately. And depending on where your project sits, what you're working on, we may be able to match you up in time to submit an application, but we may also just take you into our network and keep you in mind as we're building out a research network and thinking about how we can drive forward evidence. So hopefully that answered the bundled set of questions around the practitioner researcher relationship. But if there are others, I'm happy to continue to lean in on that front. Caleb, do you want to take the question about folks who are working outside of urban versus inside?
Yep. So yeah, we had a question, is this grant only for practitioners who are partnering with research evaluation teams outside of urban, or can we be working on a project with urban currently? So we are accepting applications that involve the Urban Institute, but we are treating those a little bit different because, as you might think, we have some bias for that. So what we are doing is we are sending those proposals to external expert reviewers outside the Urban Institute, and we're requiring 3/4 approval from the leadership board to advance them. And that was the process that we established last year, and that we'll be using again this year. So, again, we will accept them, but just know that they will be treated just a little bit differently from some of the others to avoid some home team bias.
There are a few questions about whether funding is available for research that's already underway. And the answer to that is yes. I'm a researcher myself. I'm well aware of the fact that we always need more money to make our research as impactful as possible. I would encourage you, if you're applying for a project that's underway, and this should be an obvious point, to make very clear how the additional funding will actually magnify the impact or why it's necessary. But just because you have an already funded project is not a reason to not apply. We encourage you for sure to apply. There's also a question about who should apply. If you've got a partner, is it better for the research partner to take the lead, or should the nonprofit, the service provider, do the application given the different types of business? I don't think technically it matters. I think the honest answer is that it's up to you, and obviously depending on capacity and who's got the time and ability to populate the form, it's really up to you. But that being said, whoever applies is going to be the main point of contact for us. And so I would have that guide the decision. We're likely to have questions about the research design as we go through the evaluation process in the near term. We're also likely, if we fund you, to want to engage with your partner. So I think it's really up to you there. There's no preference for one or the other, so long as whoever applies is able to actually engage in the evaluation process if and when your process moves, or your application moves ahead. Question on substance of whether we consider programs that support self-employed workers. The answer to that is yes, for sure. Self-employed workers is an interesting category, particularly in the context of gig work and everything else. So by all means, we are very expansive in terms of how we think about what sort of counts as work and who we're interested in. We recognize that the low-wage labor market is made up of all different types of workers with all different types of work arrangements. And so self-employed workers are completely fair game, particularly given the overlap between self-employment and more formal employment for many, many folks and the flow between the two. Caleb, do you want to take the questions? There are a couple questions on operations logistics, including indirect costs and some other things. Can I toss it back to you to handle some logistical questions?
Sure. So some of this information, I believe, will live in our FAQ if it doesn't already. Yeah, as the website mentions, indirect costs are on a case-by-case basis. So yeah, go ahead and use your institution's full indirect cost rate in the budget estimate. Yep. Yeah, I think that's straightforward, yes. And I think in some cases for universities that have sort of like this 15% cap, we just advise that they stick with that.
Great. There are a couple questions asking about organizations that have internal research departments. If you work for an organization that does both service provision and has an internal research department, yes, you count as a researcher. So just because you provide services does not mean that you need to go out and find some other kind of researcher. If you have a research team inside, you are fully eligible. We are eager to see your proposals for sure. And semi-relatedly, there's a question about levels of evidence and whether we're open to community-based participatory action research that relies on narrative forms of assessment. The answer to that is also yes. We are looking to fund diverse projects, not only from sort of institutional, geographic, and other forms of diversity, but also methodological and disciplinary diversity. So we are eager to see applications that use qualitative methods, that use community-based methods. So by all means, please do apply. We're equally eager to see your standard RCT, really rigorously designed, able to identify like to the decimal point causal estimates, but we know for sure that those are not the only kind of evidence, and in fact are often not the evidence that changes minds in the world. So please don't let your type of evidence limit you in terms of applying. There's another question about matched comparison group designs, whether those are competitive. Based on my last answer, I think it's probably obvious that the answer to that is yes. We do review with regards to methodological rigor, and so making sure that what you promise matches the methods that you are setting out there to use is certainly important, but we are not an RCT only or looking for precise causal estimates as the one and only thing that we're looking to fund for the reasons that I noted earlier. One more question that I'll take, and then I'll toss it back to Caleb in case there are questions that I'm missing. Someone asked how this year's RFP is different from the one that went out early, and by early, I think that means last year. If you submitted an LOI last year and weren't asked to submit a full proposal, is there a possibility of getting feedback before submitting this year? So we are not going back through our applications from last year in any systematic way. If you're planning on applying this year and you applied last year, you're welcome to reach out. Depending on the volume of inquiries that we get, our likelihood of being able to respond to everyone may vary. We have a small, amazing team, but we are a limited number of people. So I would encourage you to reach back out if you're planning on reapplying, and recognize that if you don't hear back from us or don't hear back from us with a super substantive answer, that it is just due to the fact that we have many, many, many more applications coming in than we have people to actually carefully handle each one of them. But we're doing our very best. Part of what we're looking to do through this process is actually build out networks and relationships. Many of those will be with folks who are not able to support with dollars. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you've got something that you think deserves our attention. Caleb, I'm going to turn it back to you, although there are a couple of questions that I could take as well if you don't have questions that are in the operations logistics bucket, but I want to give you a chance to answer those.
Sure. So I see there's one that do studies with pilots tend to get the higher end of the funding? I think the answer there is just a straightforward, it depends. It's the scale of the pilot. Obviously, they tend to be more involved, so we tend to get submissions with higher budgets in that case. But it's not necessarily the case that we're defaulting to higher funding levels for pilots. There's also a question about, is there a preference for deliverables that are open source versus proprietary, or a combination of both? And I think the answer there, and Elizabeth can chime in a little bit if I steer us in the wrong direction, but we want something that can be public facing, that there's no sort of like paywall to access, although we will support journal articles as well on the side, but we do need some version of a public facing open source product that can be, kind of hosted on the WorkRise website and those kinds of things to increase the visibility of the work.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I'd encourage you, I know, as is so often the case, especially in empirical work using large data sets, that increasingly there are really interesting proprietary data sets that folks are able to use to answer new questions. So please, if you have one of those or would like to actually apply for funding in order to use one of those, don't let that stop you, but know that we'd like you to think hard about how, assuming you get results from your work to share, to think hard about how you would actually share them to make sure that they have impact, again, as Caleb said, beyond the journal article and beyond what you learn. And I will note too that one of the things that WorkRise is eager to do with our grantees is to build with them those kind of publicly accessible tools. And so it is, by all means, not on you, and this is largely to my friends in academia who may have no idea how to build an infographic and not want to spend their research funds paying for consultants who could build out an infographic doing really cool stuff with their data, right? WorkRise has a communications team that once we have results from work that we've funded, we're very eager to work with you on that. That's the kind of thing that we're eager to have you think about ahead of time. And by all means, if you work with folks who can do that kind of translational work, plug it into your grant proposal or into your LOI. But if not, think about it and let us know what you would love for us to be able to do with your findings. And that's related to the proprietary data question, but I think is applicable to all applicants, and just really urging people to think about that, reaching a broad audience from the get-go. There's a question about dissertation research and wanting to know if we fund dissertation research. We have no limits in terms of who can apply, in terms of where you are in your academic career. So by all means, please apply. We evaluate projects based on the merit of the project. And no one's going to get a bump or bumped down because it is a dissertation. I will say that we're thinking about going forward how to potentially create some equity, because it's quite difficult if you're a dissertation student and your project is your dissertation project is competing against a tenured professor with a multi-million-dollar lab. That's a challenge, and we recognize that. We have at this point a kind of trying to create a level playing field for everyone, and we're thinking hard about how going forward as we build out a grants program that's designed to actually empower folks who are in early stage in their careers. How do we do that more effectively? This year, however, the short answer is yes, please apply to us, and we are open to funding your dissertation if the project is a fit for our work. There's a question on secondary data analysis that I'll also take, and then there's a few more process questions. We're definitely open to secondary data analysis. I am a huge fan of secondary data analysis because I think there is so much secondary data out there that doesn't necessarily get analyzed to answer the most interesting questions. So you need not be collecting your own data to be competitive. Full stop. Caleb, I'm going to toss it back to you for a couple process questions.
Yes, so we had a question about what is the timetable from LOI to funding? A somewhat tricky question, but it does raise a very interesting point that I think I forgot to mention when I gave the demonstration, and that this is sort of a two-step process. So we will be evaluating the LOIs in the month of July. We'll be looping back with a subset of finalists to submit full proposal information, and that's some clarifications about your research approach, and some basic budget and organizational information that we would need for GCO. And from those finalists, we will select the grantees. So it works if you were part of the process last year, you might be familiar with that. In terms of the timetable, our goal is to announce awards this fall, sometime around October, after we've gone through the full application process. And then from there, it will kind of depend on the timetable of different contracting process. But we're hoping that projects can launch as soon as possible, but at the latest early next year.
There's a question getting back to kind of the matching between service provision and research and how we think about that, asking whether research projects can utilize applied approaches that merge service provision with research. And so the answer to that is yes. We encourage you to be thoughtful. Obviously, having the research and service provision going on at the same time, in many cases, given that mobility outcomes happen over time, is in fact like totally necessary, but it also raises design challenges. And so this probably goes without saying for any of you considering a research design that's doing both at once. Think hard about that, but by all means, we are happy to consider projects that do both. The one thing I'll say, and I don't think there's been a question specific to this, but I do want to address it, is whether we fund the service provision or just the research. And the answer is a little bit, it depends. So we are aiming to direct most of our funds to the research. We recognize that in some cases, having a research component complicates the service provision delivery, or having an additional piece of service provision funded would be incredibly helpful in making the research happen. So we are open to funding some part of service provision, but we are largely a research funding entity, and we encourage you to take that seriously when you apply. If that's more confusing than clarifying, I encourage you to reach out to us directly, but we know that in some cases, there needs to be a little bit of additional money for standing up a project in order to have research attached to it, and so we try to be flexible and take that on a case-by-case basis. I am looking at our list of questions. There are two on reporting process for those who are awarded a grant, and then a question on the expected duration of the project. I'm going to take the expected duration piece and then toss it back to Caleb on the reporting process. So the expected duration is 12 to 18 months, or the expected duration of the grant. Again, we know, and I mentioned this earlier, and I will say it again, that mobility outcomes happen over time. We are well aware of that, and we are trying to fund a portfolio that's balanced, that's going to give us some near-term evidence, because as one of my friends says, having research done is a little bit like watching paint dry, and the world can't wait for all of us to finish our perfect research projects. They're going to tell us like 5 to 10 year outcomes. That being said, not everything has to have a near-term turnaround. Some of the most important questions require patience. If you are applying for a project where you don't expect to have results for some time, we encourage you to think about interim results and how you and we might lift those up to add to the evidence base sooner rather than later, even if the ultimate outcome that we're looking, or your project is looking to identify, is going to fall outside that 12 to 18 month scope. The short answer to that question is 12 to 18 months is typically the duration of the grant. Caleb, do you want to take the reporting process question?
Yes. So I was trying to look up whether it was semi-annual or annual reporting, because it's been a while since I've looked at that. But yeah, basically once we get your award set up, there will be just periodic reporting, and we view that as a relationship with you, because our goal through grant making is to generate the evidence and then lift it up, increase the visibility. So there'll be kind of short periodic narrative reports, and then phone calls around that with the research teams, and those are just opportunities to surface any issues, updates on timetable, those types of things. So I can make a note to insert that into our FAQ when we update it and follow up, whether it's annual or semi-annual, based on what we've laid out.
Great. I think we may have exhausted your questions. We've covered a lot. I'm going to just be quiet for another 30 seconds, just in case there are any last questions that arise before we wrap up. I see one question about whether a team can have an unpaid partner institution, and the answer to that is yes, for sure. It actually didn't occur to me in some case that the partner would necessarily be paid. So by all means, the nature of the partnership is important to describe to us, but the financial relationship is not necessarily key to that. There's a question on whether we fund research on disconnected youth, and the answer to that is a definite yes, obviously as it relates to mobility. But yes, of course, we recognize youth engagement in the labor market to be a real issue. Similarly, there's another question on higher priority populations within the population of interest. As we've noted throughout, we are particularly interested in Black and other workers of color, in no small part because of what we know in terms of the evidence, in terms of historical and ongoing disadvantage. That being said, we are interested in all different kinds of diversity and all kinds of questions. So please don't let that be a limiting factor, but it is to say that we're particularly interested in that piece. As has been noted in the chat, and as I said throughout, we are eager to answer your questions. As a relatively new organization, we're trying hard to make sure that we fund research in an impactful and slightly different way than is often done. And opportunities like this to engage with potential applicants, potential grantees are a really helpful way for us to kind of learn while doing. So I really appreciate how engaged you all have been and how many of you have participated. So thank you. And we hope to see applications from many of you in the coming weeks. I will say, just to remind everyone, that the portal closes at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, June 27th, which happens to be my birthday, so it's a day that I will remember. But we gave all of you a firm deadline and a time for some brinksmanship. June 27th is a Sunday, and 11:59 is late at night on a Sunday. So, so you can finish it up, and we'll be eager to dig in first thing on Monday morning to take a look at what's coming through the portal. Thank you all again. Have a tremendous afternoon, and I hope to be in touch with many of you going forward. Eastern time, yes, thank you. I'm East Coast centric, I apologize. 11:59 p.m. June 27th, Eastern Standard Time. All right, thanks all.